Hello, welcome everyone. I'm excited to be joined today by our speaker, Varun Deshpande, for this titled Building a Carbon-Free Future, how the EA community can have high leverage impact on climate change. I'm Aya, and I'll be the MC for this session. Following this presentation, we'll move on to a live Q&A session where Varun will respond to your questions. You can submit questions through the Swapcard Live discussion feature. Then, for about 45 minutes, we'll bring the session to an end. Now, I would like to introduce our speaker for this session. Varun founded and runs the Institute for Climate Innovation, a new field-building organization focused on advancing decarbonization in the Global South across science, industry, and policy. He also advises and serves the board for other nonprofits and for-profit ventures across global health, technology, and the philanthropic sector. Previously, he served as founding managing director for Good Food Institute India in 2017 to 2021. And then he served as president for the Asia at Good Food Institute during 2021 to 2023, where he worked with scientists, foundations, governments, entrepreneurs, and corporations to build the alternative protein sector across the continent. So for this talk today, Varun would like to explore climate change, not being a traditional EA course area on the basis of tractability and neglectedness. Varun will posit that a closer examination reveals major opportunities for high leverage impact. As the global community grows, particularly in Asia and the Global South, we should think expansively and see the climate change as a major cause area of opportunity alongside health, poverty, and welfare, and GCRX risk. Welcome, Varun.
Thank you so much, Aya, and thank you to the EAG teams for putting on this wonderful program and for all the work that you do across the world. So as Aya said, my name is Varun Deshpande. Before I begin, I should offer a couple of caveats or underpinning principles. My experience is primarily in the Global South, and so that's going to have a major impact on how I put forward the arguments in this talk. I also want to say apologies for the sounds of Mumbai in the background, which you're probably hearing right now. And then additionally, thank you very much to the other folks in the EA community who are thinking about these questions, including the likes of Giving Green, Founders Pledge, Rethink Priorities. There's a lot of researchers and wonderful folks who are doing work in this area. And you'll see that I've been influenced by their thinking, and that's driven some of our program building at the Institute for Climate Innovation. Okay, I'm going to get started here. So I guess the big question that people in the EA community have had traditionally within EA is why should we even work on climate? I mean, it's a problem that's sort of on a path to being solved, right? So there's huge global aggregate spending on climate. If you look at any of the IEA or other folks that are kind of I guess estimating all of this, you'll see it's over $1 trillion a year. There's a bunch of global and regional plans based on nationally determined contributions that have set forth goals for net zero, et cetera. So India has one for 2070, Thailand for 2060, et cetera. There's a large number of organizations already doing work on the ground in India and the Global South. There's a lot of noise in the kind of investing and early stage startup space for climate technology. And there have been a lot of major successes already in some spaces of climate, right? So solar energy, wind energy, electric vehicle penetration, countries like India are already moving when it comes to the market for electric vehicles, et cetera. But I think the claim that I'm making here today and that others within the EA community are making with respect to climate is that everything we do, generates carbon. And when you kind of zoom in on climate change and you kind of redefine climate change, the idea that it's actually over-indexed might actually be incorrect, right? So what climate change is not or should not be defined as potentially is everything else that isn't rising global temperatures caused by greenhouse gas emissions. Sorry, I have no idea what's going on. Okay, I'm going to try that again, right? So how we should potentially define climate change is mitigation of rising global temperatures that are caused by greenhouse gas emissions and all the negative planet modification that's been carried out by the human race. And everything else that is conservation, biodiversity, air and water quality, all of these other things are very worthy things to work on but they're actually downstream of climate change. They're not climate change themselves. So when we look through that lens, we'll see a different picture. So when you see kind of what's happening already, the path that we should be on right now in terms of mitigating those issues, we should be on this path where we're already getting to a point where net emissions are reducing. And you'll see on the right of that graph, you'll see the kind of implementation of new technologies for carbon capture, for direct air carbon capture, et cetera. But where we actually are is different. So some of these models of what we think will happen from the IPCC and others who study this stuff all the time, they kind of look at those models and they say, well, or they look at those graphs and they say, well, we should actually be reducing over time our emissions per person. The problem with some of these models, if you look at the far right, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera, these models assume that the emissions intensity or the per capita emissions per person in some of these regions like South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa don't go up at all, right? Now, here's what's actually happening. And I've only taken a basket of 4 countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia. You'll see India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand. And I almost chose those at random, but specifically for rising populations, rising industrial activity, et cetera, the per capita emissions are actually going up rapidly and kind of drastically. And that's reflected in the share of global emissions. So the idea that the per capita emissions are not going to go up from these countries is simply incorrect. And that curve that we saw on what should be happening right now is simply incorrect as well. So we get to this picture where, in 2050, some of the regions or the countries that are currently the most polluting or emitting actually constitute a minority of emissions in that time frame, right? So the EU is about 3%, the US is about 6%, rest of the world is 65% in that time frame in 2050. India, where I come from, is about 17%, or estimated to be about 17% in that time. And you might argue, well, this sort of makes sense, right? I mean, most of the population of the world is in the global south anyway. This might just be a rebalancing. One of the issues with that is, of course, that the global south between now and then, in terms of the human cost, the economic cost, the cost of biodiversity, animal life, et cetera, is particularly vulnerable to all of these impacts. So we're already seeing this happen in countries like India, in regions like Southeast Asia. We're seeing extreme weather events. We're seeing landslides. We're seeing lots of issues with rising ocean levels, et cetera. And you have a lot of these major downstream impacts of that, right? So tipping points in the ecosystem collapse, a lot of things that are happening where, the billion people that are reliant on subsistence, fishing, et cetera, globally are going to be hugely impacted by all of this, right? And of course, I don't need to put up pictures for this audience on the screen of what's already happened or what happens in these countries. But I will say that COVID-19, the pandemic, where we saw a lot of pandemic migration, especially in places like India, is a sign of things to come when it comes to these things, right? So we saw huge numbers, hundreds of thousands of people moving from cities in India where transportation systems were gridlocked. And I think there's going to be a lot of climate migration, political strife, et cetera. That's pretty clear from what's coming over the next couple of decades. So it's pretty clear that, and this is something that we all sort of agree with, climate change is a large problem. The scale is known. It's kind of everybody's business. And we need grand plans to tackle it, right? And there's people who have grand plans who are working on it. This is kind of what the broad playbook for climate change looks like. We have these mature technologies, as I mentioned earlier, like solar, wind, we have electric vehicles, and there's a bunch of innovation needed there as well, but we need to deploy and scale those. We also need to invest in breakthrough technologies that are coming down the pipeline and then focus on deploying them, things like geothermal energy, nuclear energy, et cetera. And then crucially, we also need to think globally in multiple time scales across the next 100 or so years so that we can solve this problem, depending on which technology it is, depending on which region it is, et cetera. But the scale of this problem, as I say, is known. And it might not be enough to argue that the EA community should work on it. So, based on kind of how the EA community has been thinking about this and building principles for working on climate change, my understanding or my thinking around this is that we should work on climate change if currently the mainstream response or the resources that are being allocated towards climate are misallocated, or if that grand plan isn't currently being allocated in a way that makes sense. And then, of course, if we can actually improve it, right? So this actually looks very much like an EA argument in terms of scale, tractability, neglectedness, et cetera. So let's kind of go back to that big picture, $1 trillion a year that's being spent on climate. And thank you to Founders Pledge for looking at a lot of these questions. But $1 trillion a year that's being spent on climate right now is primarily, as I say, industry spending, government spending, etc. If you look at climate philanthropy, it's a small proportion of that at about $10 billion a year. And actually, if you look at the climate philanthropy that's coming from within the EA landscape, it's vanishingly small currently compared to this. Now, if you look at where that climate philanthropy is going, this is from ClimateWorks, you'll see that most of it is going towards those mature technologies. So things like solar, wind, etc. It's going to nature. It's going to things that aren't within that definition of what I said earlier, which is mitigation. And it is primarily being allocated to OECD countries, where, as we've discussed, the emissions trajectory is actually shifting to some of these other regions over the next couple of decades. Now, those mature technologies where philanthropy is currently being allocated, they weren't always mature, right? So something happened to bring them to a point where they could be scaled up. So if you look at solar panel prices, lithium-ion batteries, etc., something happened from a technology standpoint, from a kind of scaling standpoint, that helped them get to the point where they can be deployed widely right now and be lauded as the success stories that they're being lauded as right now. It turns out that kind of policy interventions and systems change interventions seem to be absolutely key to this. And this is from Giving Green. But if you look at solar or batteries, something on the order of 50% plus of that cost decrease can be attributed to public policy based on some of these research papers. And that's why Giving Green says, if you look at any of the interventions that philanthropy or the EA landscape can look at to advance kind of mitigation in climate right now, systems change is very clearly the highest impact thing that we can do from a cost effectiveness standpoint. And on that basis, we have sort of a global proto community that's forming in climate change, where the focus is, as I've been saying, on high leverage and impacting kind of the mainstream response, moving the marginal mainstream funds moving mainstream funds on the margin rather than core EA funds. These organizations are the likes of Founders Pledge, Giving Green, as I've mentioned. EAGxVirtual in Germany does a great job of directing money towards these causes. We have new kind of program-focused organizations like us that are called Future Matters, Future Clean Tech Architects. And then we have EA adjacent institutions that are being built or that are being scaled. University of Chicago Market Shaping Accelerator is a great example that are advancing new thinking and financing that can get us to a better place. And then if you look at kind of the sector focus that the likes of these organizations are saying makes sense. So this is from Giving Green, advanced nuclear, alternative proteins, aviation and shipping decarbonization. So once again, you'll see that, obviously solar and wind and EVs have scaled or are scaling, so they might not need as much support from the community. Okay, to the question of whether we can actually impact on the margin some of these things to move forward, or resources on the margin to move forward. This is from Founders Pledge. Clean Air Task Force is a great organization in the US that themselves report that there is no way they would have been able to scale to the degree that they are now if it weren't for Founders Pledge identifying them as a very high impact opportunity for giving, right? So Clean Air Task Force was something on the order of a $7 million organization. Now they're something on the order of a $50 million+ organization, and a significant proportion of that has been the intervention of Founders Pledge identifying them as a place where donors should give. So this should give us a bit of encouragement that the EA community can have quite a high impact when it comes to identifying program organizations that can absorb funding and scale up. Okay, so let's, if we take a step back and look at some of the things that we need to accomplish, I've pulled this up from a McKinsey report on India's emissions mix currently. Of course, a huge proportion of what needs to be done to solve climate or mitigate emissions is the energy transition. That much is known. That being said, there is a huge kind of fat tail of other things that still need to be done. So industry, agriculture, steel and cement is one that people talk about all the time. Just to zoom in on that example, India still needs to build about 80% of the infrastructure that's been identified in India's 2047 building plan, so development plan, 2047 being 100 years since India gained independence. So that there's a huge amount of work that's still going to happen in terms of development on the ground in countries like India, Indonesia, etc. To offer another example, something on the order of 14% of the population in Indonesia has regular access to air conditioning, right? So when we build out this additional infrastructure in these countries, making sure that we're on a low carbon growth path rather than the default growth path probably is something that we all want to pay attention to. And with respect to that low carbon growth path, this is obviously a global south consideration rather than something related to the global north. But I just wanted to highlight, so again, from the same McKinsey report on India, the default pathway seems to be that we are not on that low carbon growth path. And that's obviously very concerning, right? So if you look at any of these scenarios, there would have to be a significant amount of success and effort. And it doesn't seem like we're on that path for many of these newer technologies to break through. So things like carbon capture, things like, obviously, as I said, iron and steel decarbonization, clean cooling, adding to the kind of energy basket. So there's a lot that we need to do to move forward that actually is not happening on the default pathway. Okay, so kind of zooming in on what I just said, most of the resources, unfortunately, and this is logical, right? So if I'm saying that we're not on that pathway, most of the resources are currently flowing towards solar, wind, and hydro. They're flowing towards electric vehicles. And when I say resources here, I mean private as well as public. And they're flowing to adaptation resilience. Now, once again, I want to underline that I believe adaptation or resilience is a worthy thing to do. But it seems like it's going to crowd in a number of resources, whether it's aid rupees or dollars, whether it's political attention, whether it's other nonprofits in the space working on kind of farmer relief programs, etc. There's still a lot of work to do there, but the default pathway is to allocate resources there. So all of this means that the focus on mitigation is definitely blurred. And a significant number of those other technologies that I mentioned are definitely lacking the support that they need. So coming back to what I said earlier, global philanthropy in climate is not being allocated to these countries or to anything except the mature technologies on any appreciable level. And local philanthropy and resources are not being accorded to these problems either. If you look at kind of reports from the likes of the India Climate Collaborative, and there are similar reports for Southeast Asia, for Brazil, etc., they will show you that a significant proportion of the resources are going into all of those mature areas that I mentioned before. In fact, the same report from India Climate Collaborative shows that there's about 11 headings that account for 70% of all philanthropy on the ground in India, or climate philanthropy on the ground in India. And none of these include the likes of what I've said before by way of mitigating emissions. So I guess the question then is, why hasn't this happened already? And can we solve this? I mean, why hasn't it happened already? I mean, the reasons that I'm positing here are globally, the issues of political pressure and local constituencies, let's say on the ground in the US or in the EU, are making politicians as well as capital allocators who could be philanthropic dedicate all of their funding locally in these markets. So places like Germany, the US, etc., are perhaps not deploying capital as much as they should to places like the global south or to the less mature technologies, particularly with, let's say, countries like India. There might be a lot of market risk. There's no line of sight to the local ecosystems. So it's hard to deploy philanthropic capital here without necessarily knowing the players well, without having a presence on the ground. And that's because the ecosystems themselves are not as well developed. There aren't as many trusted partners. And so you might not feel that there's viable funding opportunities on the ground, right? And then obviously, when it comes to local philanthropy, there's just a dearth of overall rupees or dollars on the ground. And therefore, there isn't as much systems change work that's ongoing. So, having done a lot of this work prior at the Good Food Institute as well, one thing I've realized is that kind of the causality cannot flow in reverse. Ecosystems need to be built that can become viable funding targets before we're able to actually move all of those resources. So that's kind of the order of operations here, right? So we need to create a mature ecosystem, ability to absorb capital into a lot of these institutions, and then we'll be able to kind of move a lot of money and solve these problems. So just diving into that a little bit further, I mean, when it comes to the Global South, which again I say is my area of expertise or my area of experience, we do have kind of challenging socio-political regulatory environments. We have capital controls on accepting philanthropic capital from abroad. There might be kind of less developed ecosystems of support in academia, nonprofits. in the corporate realm, etc. Talent is being lost to a bunch of different cause areas and countries abroad. Of course, the overall availability of funding is not as high. And then just sort of ease of doing business or ease of life is not as high. But the flip side of that is that there's a huge opportunity, of course, in these countries, right? So we have, young workforce, oftentimes English speaking. We're speaking to India every month between 2011 and 2030, 1 million Indians are turning 18 years old. So there is this huge English speaking talent pool, which has generally good reputations globally. We have, a broader background, I guess, track record of support from the broader global development sector, including the EA landscape. And then there's, these supply chains that have been built up, not just India, of course, but countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, et cetera, that have Thailand, that have done really, really good work in building up supply chains that could kind of have a significant spillover effect into some of these climate areas as well. And then interestingly, there has been a recent rebalancing in geopolitics, which we're still in the middle of, but we see these new kind of mini lateral alignments. G20 has been a very interesting thing. India hosted G20 last year with a lot of kind of fanfare. There's the Quad, there's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. There are a lot of these different alignments that might be good backdrops to kind of move forward ecosystems and accept more resources, capital, philanthropy, et cetera, into these countries to build this up. So based on what I said earlier, we need to build local ecosystems to kind of move things forward on climate in these countries. My argument is that the field building approach is particularly apt for something like this and is in line with EA principles. So field building is this kind of nebulous, interesting term that's been getting increasing attention within the EA landscape, and you'll see why. I mean, the idea is to bring disparate multidisciplinary stakeholders together, especially where there's a large, complex goal which requires coordination. And you usually have to do a lot of thinking as well as doing. So the way that it sort of works in practice, which is quite intuitive, is you identify gaps and you kind of build roadmaps to solve it, to like sort of field-wide priorities. You convene institutions where they exist and kind of do pre-competitive coordination. Where they don't exist, you need to inspire action and build new institutions. And then, of course, at a kind of doing level, there may be a need to build a direct program and have a specialized interest in a particular area, for example, talent development or whatever, right? And then at the end of it all, the idea of field building is to kind of make yourself obsolete, to create an ecosystem and then take a step back so it's kind of self-sustaining, right? And on that note, I'd be happy to, by the way, send across any details about this to anyone that's interested. The questions that you have to sort of ask yourself are, is that ecosystem self-renewing? Can it be sustainable? What are the ingredients to its success? What institutions need to exist? And then ideally, you're able to identify high leverage points and kind of get things moving where they're absolutely needed. And then ultimately take a step back, as I've said, and kind of codify the lessons, move to like a meta level of road mapping and stewardship. And by the way, oftentimes there might not be a highest leverage point. Maybe you need to build the whole thing. Yeah. And ultimately, kind of the principles that you want to think about are population level change, influencing the actions of others, getting things done, not necessarily building consensus. And as I've said, kind of building your organization to win, not necessarily to last. So the idea is you're building a field that can exist beyond your own organization's existence. So yeah, we think this is an approach that works really well and can be extremely high leverage in this space. So a relatively small organization can have a huge amount of impact in building ecosystems that can absorb billions or tens of billions of dollars to solve all of these problems on the margin. And that's what we're doing at the Institute for Climate Innovation. We're a new field building organization. We're advancing decarbonization specifically in India and the global South, based on everything I've said here in terms of the trajectory of emissions and what we know. And we work across science, industry, and policy. We're looking at some of the sectors that have been already identified in what I've said earlier. So things like geothermal energy, maritime shipping decarbonization, steel and cement is huge, as I've said, particularly for India and Southeast Asia, heating and cooling, chemicals, carbon sequestration. These are the things that we're looking at. And I think a critical point here is that this is all quite large. We're looking at a horizontal slice across these spaces. So from a field building standpoint, there are already multiple institutions doing great work in many of these areas. And for us, we'd look to intervene more in a high leverage way rather than building vertically from the ground up in any of these spaces. In terms of our program work, and I'll dive quickly into this, we do work in science and technology, industry and policy. We have some support departments. And then critically, I think what we've realized in terms of what these ecosystems need at a systems level, so across all of these spaces, most actors in the ecosystem need things like a coordinated science program, systematic international cooperation, market shaping or activation on the industry side, and then building climate philanthropy. So just really quickly diving into these. What does sort of robust coordinated science mean? It means some of the stuff I've said before. So field-wide analysis and road mapping, what's happening at lab, pilot, demonstration, and shovel-ready for scale-up levels across some of these areas. So who's doing the best research, for instance, in green cement? How can we create research collaborations from Denmark, where perhaps this research is happening, into India or Indonesia or wherever? How can we stimulate technology transfer, locate within the context of the developing world, what translational research is needed, et cetera. So this sort of analysis, road mapping, coordinated communities, and then ideally advising governments and other philanthropic organizations to kind of allocate and scale up this work. And sorry, just finally, there might need to be some specialized infrastructure that's needed for all of this as well. So there might need to be networks of centers of excellence that are focused on this stuff. So if you operate in any of these countries, you might know that as a researcher, some of the issues exist in lack of pilot scale equipment or lack of opportunities to kind of do this research because you might not have the labs that are needed to move things forward. And then critically, I just want to underline that a lot of the work that does happen in coordinated science now focuses on a particular end of a spectrum. So on the left of this particular diagram, we are arguing that actually science programs should be across this entire spectrum. So it's R&D is not really R&D, it's actually R&D and D&D. There's research, development, demonstration, deployment. Our intent is to operate kind of in the first two Ds, so research, development, and demonstration, and then hope that the market can offtake and deploy some of these technologies. And of course, it's not guaranteed. So you'll see again, within this landscape, and of course, I would worry less about the words that's on the screen and sort of more conceptually here. The idea here is that all of the other actors in the ecosystem definitely need support in terms of getting access to technologies that can be transferred to the market and scaled. But their current operating model, so let's say venture capitalists' current operating model, doesn't actually include the ability to robustly identify these technologies, right? So a lot of what they're doing is risk capital. So there's this big gap in terms of what needs to exist in the ecosystem, and that's what we're looking to fill with this kind of coordinated science program. When it comes to industry, we're still evaluating, but our argument is that you actually need a little more light touch coordination. So everything I've said thus far, things like steel, cement, et cetera, there's so many coalitions that are currently set up by the mainstream actors, so maybe larger nonprofits, industry associations, et cetera, that have identified that we need more green steel, we need more green cement, we need to engage the government to get some incentives to move these things forward. So our intention is to join these coalitions, and if it's needed in certain areas, we might build new coalitions. And then critically, there is definitely a need for bringing in finances in ways that it doesn't finance in ways that it doesn't currently exist in the ecosystem. So things like demand aggregation, things like specific innovation prizes, et cetera, that can help unlock some of these key bottlenecks. And then I should underline that sometimes it's simply not possible to move a particular industry forward. So I'm not 100% on this, so don't quote us on this yet. But if you look at the top right box here, you'll see nuclear power plants that are, these are highly complex things to build. We are still not sure if it's going to be possible to stimulate nuclear energy in a place like India, right? So we don't actually have engineering EPC companies, engineering procurement construction companies in India that have built nuclear power plants before, right? So when it comes to deciding what program areas we're going to focus on, we're not sure if it's possible to do that. There would need to be a significant technology transfer component, expertise transfer component. And we saw this during the pandemic, right? So industries like vaccine manufacturing were not possible to stimulate, or even with that kind of urgency mindset that that kind of war footing mindset. In countries like India, in places like Southeast Asia, mRNA vaccines didn't make it there, even though industries were trying to collaborate and move the thing forward. The good news, of course, is that we do have some of these other areas of technologies that have been scaled. So once again, we have electric vehicles, we have solar, and we can kind of learn from their experience curves of what's worked in the past, what sort of ecosystem actors came together to move it forward. So once again, I think because we can learn about all of this, we actually have the ability to be quite high leverage in the EA community, in organizations like ours, to move some of these things forward. Moving on to policy, we have the ambition to participate in national and subnational policy work. There are, of course, a ton of people already doing excellent work there. And we have our specializations in R&D and D&D, as I've mentioned, so in coordinated science that we'll be working on. One thing that we feel is systematically ignored here is kind of very dialed in international cooperation. So what we are going to cutely call, I suppose, climate innovation corridors. But the idea here is there's a huge amount of capital that's sitting on the sidelines from actors, including policy and social funders, that can participate in different parts of the world. And I'll speak a little bit further to this in a little while. But and then I think critically, we need to work across partisan divides. So I'm sure everyone's been following, the election results in different parts of the world, the United States, Germany, et cetera. And I think the climate landscape, the mainstream landscape, has been disheartened by the idea that perhaps we're receding from climate action. But we think that there's certainly a possibility to work with governments, or there's a need to work with governments regardless of which side of the political aisle they fall on, right? So your arguments sort of change, and your kind of persuasive style changes depending on whom you're working with. But you definitely need to work with these folks. Okay, so just as a quick example to underline what I was saying earlier, this is a great case study and a book actually called How Solar Became Cheap. You'll see on the top left there, there's a guy, Einstein, who shows up in a bunch of science stuff. He discovered something called the photoelectric effect, for which he won the Nobel Prize. Then you have a bunch of labs, including Bell Labs in the US, that kind of messed around with this, did a bunch of innovation with this. And they were able to kind of move this technology into photovoltaic modules. You had government funding, significant government funding from the likes of the US and Japan that kind of moved it forward into early high value applications. So these solar PV modules were initially used in satellites and really high-end consumer electronics, and that were actually not scalable for solar applications. But then over time, the cost came down to the point that they could actually be used for solar energy. So just as a quick example here, or as a quick kind of zoom in here, you'll see that the US federal PV R&D funding had a huge kind of dispositive effect to bringing down the cost of this over time. And then critically, Germany, in terms of public funding, put in the late 90s to the kind of mid 2000s, has put in about $200 billion in public funding. So without all of these actions, this kind of innovation cascade simply would not have happened, particularly the public funding that moved solar to a point where it could be used in PV modules and scaled up. Yeah, okay. So just as a quick aside here, a lot of what I've said sounds like it might be applied differently in different spaces, and that's quite correct, right? So field building, as I've said earlier, is kind of a nebulous term, but the idea here is that some spaces like geothermal energy or maritime shipping decarbonization don't actually have a lot of people working on them in countries like India, places like Southeast Asia, et cetera. So they do need kind of vertical ground up building, and the kind of tasks that you might undertake, or we will undertake in these areas, the programs that we will undertake in these areas, are quite different. They might involve getting early stage dialogue started with governments, with industry players, getting folks to recognize that this is an opportunity area in the first place. But there are more advanced spaces where you can be very high leverage and play a catalyst role and get something moving faster than it would have otherwise moved, like steel and cement. And then finally, so I've spoken about science, I've spoken about industry, I've spoken about policy. I did want to highlight that building climate philanthropy is absolutely key. And I think, some of the work that we're doing on the ground in India and Southeast Asia is exactly to do this. We're working with the likes of Giving Pie, which you can check out their website. It's a great organization in India, kind of working with other program partners on the ground in India, so other think tanks, other nonprofits, to help them build capacity to be laser focused on mitigation as we've defined earlier, so that then we can make sure that they are better funding targets for the kind of donors that we are engaging. And then we're interested in doing more of these, but we're doing some peer meetings, donor events, etc., including with some of these new exciting orgs in the EA space. And our org plan, I'm just going to quickly say this. We're launching new roles now. Our goal is to build program teams in India, sister programs in Southeast Asia, and then kind of have satellite teams in other parts of the world where we can move more philanthropy and more political attention to some of these problems. I just want to quickly highlight that I've said a bunch of stuff. All of this is definitely wildly ambitious, which is a phrase that someone from the EA landscape said to me earlier. And we agree that it is. That's why we think that we can definitely absorb more talent. We believe that we can get more folks in EA, and we should get more folks in EA thinking about these problems and collaborating with us. In terms of how you're thinking about your career in climate, if you're interested, we'd love to kind of talk to you. Some recommendations that I would suggest you could look at. There's an organization called TerraDo that runs these educational fellowships. There's a number of existing climate fellowships globally. Please get in touch with us if you'd like to know more. The policy ecosystem, as I've said, is particularly high leverage, especially if you can build some of the thinking on mitigation rather than getting pulled across adaptation. So things or organizations like CEEW, WRI, CSTEP are the ones that we know in India and collaborate with, but there's a great number of international and local orgs in Southeast Asia, European Climate Foundation, Conservation International, etc., that might be worth looking at. And then if you're a scientist, please talk to us about your research plans. We'd love to talk about kind of classifying those technologies, seeing what might be high leverage to work on. And then I should say, please do look at adjacent spaces like alternative proteins. And of course, I strongly recommend GFI, no hint of a bias there. Alternative proteins are significantly impactful to climate. So land use, water use, greenhouse gas emissions, ocean dead zones, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, species loss, anything that you can think of under the broad umbrella of climate, including mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, which, as I say, should be our laser focus. Industrial animal agriculture is one of the top 3 causes of all of those things. In terms of whom within the EA landscape should think about this, and particularly as I've laid out with this kind of galaxy brain field building approach, we think the EA principles of counterfactual impact are really well suited to this. So in terms of neglectedness, tractability, all of the stuff I've said before, but you do need skills as well. So really strong operating skills, building and scaling organizations and programs, absolutely key. Of course, subject matter expertise is key as well. And I think something that's kind of neglected, and this happens as you kind of, or something that's less thought of, but is very clearly needed, is as you progress in your career and you kind of advance in some of these organizations, you will develop a very deep understanding of their operating models, their incentives. How does a government organization move? How does a philanthropic organization move? That expertise would be absolutely key to this and or any field building endeavor. And then the last thing I will say, as someone who has myself suffered from burnout or let myself suffer from burnout, it is extremely important to have a really strong rest ethic for the long timeline here. I mentioned earlier that we need kind of to think in multiple timelines across 100 years. So please do guard against burnout. I'd be happy to speak personally to anyone about this. And on that note, here's a picture of my dog because she's cute. And I wanted to end on a cute note. But please get in touch. We are at climateinnovation.earth. Our website is going up very soon. And yeah, I'm looking forward to speaking to anyone that's interested in talking about this, in collaborating. Because yeah, as I say, we can have no small plans in climate.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive presentation, Varun. It was really lovely to end the picture of your dog and to get to meet your dog as well. It's great to hear that field building climate change can use a horizontal slice approach, as you said. And looking at the live discussion, I can see that we've had a number of questions submitted already. So I'm really excited to get into the Q&A portion. As a note for those who are live streaming, if you have any questions, please add them to the Swap Credit Interaction tab. I'll be reading, starting with the ones with the highest upvotes, so you can also use this as an opportunity to upvote the questions you'd most like to hear the answers to. So now with the first one. You might have already touched on this as you were closing your question, but you haven't mentioned animal agriculture very much amongst your top areas needing intervention to mitigate effects / limit greenhouse gas emissions, although it's a main driver of climate change because it utilizes land, water, there's a risk of deforestation, etc., etc. Do you think that animal agriculture in the global south is less significant as it's currently less intensive and industrialized?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. The only reason that we at ICI are not focusing on animal agriculture is because GFI exists. It's another field building org that's doing very similar work that is a vertical solution for alternative proteins. And so that's why we're not focusing on it. But as I said, animal agriculture absolutely should be top of mind for people working on climate. And of course, it has the added benefit of also having a direct impact on animal welfare, especially if you work on farm animal agriculture, factory farms. So yeah, I mean, we certainly, I personally strongly believe that alternative proteins is something that should move forward in the same frame that I've mentioned. So things like innovation work, policy work, all of that absolutely needs to happen. Yeah, that's the only reason that we're not working on it is because GFI exists. By the way, before you ask the next question, I must apologize again for the noise outside, which kind of threw me off at the beginning. But anyways, go ahead.
That's okay. I think it's lovely to hear the colors of Mumbai in this book. So I'll move on to the next question now. You mentioned that there's a risk of resources moving from mitigation to adaptation / resilience. Given the direction we're leading with global warming and the already present impact it has in certain regions of the world, where do you think the balance should lie and what criteria play into that?
Yeah, look, great question. I mean, the first thing that I should say once again is adaptation resilience is an absolutely worthy thing to work on and should absorb a lot of resources. I guess my argument is that based on what I've seen, both in sort of spreadsheet form, but also in terms of working with and speaking with actors on the ground, that's happening anyway. So a huge proportion of funds are already going or being allocated towards adaptation. And that makes sense because there's a sort of urgency component to adaptation when you have these extreme weather events on the ground in India. We should, India, Global South, etc., and that high vulnerability that we all have, right? We should accept that we are probably very likely going to shoot past 1.5 degrees centigrade warming within the next couple of years. Right. So the definition there is if you have consistent increases of 1.5 degree temperature on a multi-year timescale, then we can have said to have shot past it. Right. So whatever the international authorities say, I think we can all assume that we're going to shoot past it. So our ability to mitigate between 1.5 degrees centigrade to, let's say, 3 or 4 is sort of where we're looking at the mitigation piece right now. Right. So that's kind of the crucial, I suppose, delta that we're able to affect. But in terms of what the proportions should be, I'm not sure how to answer that question. Even if it's as high as 90 adaptation, 10 mitigation, we're nowhere close to getting that 10 in mitigation right now, unfortunately.
That makes sense. Thank you for answering that. I will move on to the next question. How much does optimal energy transition energy vary around the world? For example, some places might vary in sunniness and windiness, or how natural disaster risk might impact nuclear power plant placement.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, things like geothermal energy might be more ideally sited in some countries than others, right? I think that's part of why we need kind of local expertise. We need folks doing this kind of work on the ground in different countries. There is nothing that can substitute for local expertise, right? Local knowledge. You can collaborate with folks like Project Inner Space is a great organization doing work on geothermal energy in the US, and they have scientific expertise in their team or on call that can help you on the ground if you wanted to do this IA on the ground in Indonesia, you could reach out to Project Inner Space and do a project on evaluating the potential of geothermal energy in Indonesia. But unless you had the capability on the ground, it's going to be unlikely that other people will be able to kind of answer this question, right? So the answer is kind of a complex one. It depends. One quick offshoot of this is we need to be very sensitive to local actors and ecosystems. So even what I have been speaking about with respect to mitigation versus adaptation, it is super important to always acknowledge and stress that we shouldn't be funging away or competing with other actors on the ground, right? And this includes, by the way, existing players, installed infrastructure in industries like the coal industry, which employ a lot of people. That's a very politically important question. It's a justice-oriented question, etc. And it really depends on which country we're talking about.
Yeah, that's very, very cool. I'll look to see what we can do here from Asia. I think we do have a couple more questions, so we'll move on to the next one, but I'll get in touch with you regarding that. Do you think funding nuclear energy research and further development in nuclear technologies help fight climate change?
Yeah, it will. I mean, it's a very edgy and it can be a controversial topic. There's a sort of history of opposition from civil society organizations, etc. There's also this kind of fascinating, interesting dynamic now where we're looking at advanced nuclear. So there's kind of Gen 2, Gen 3 reactors that are using different technologies, thorium, traveling wave, arc reactors, traveling wave reactors, etc. Things like that. It's a complex one because, as I said earlier, we don't even know if it's going to be possible to build some of these reactors and these projects on a timescale and with a budget that makes sense vis-a-vis other options, right? So that's something we're still evaluating. The one consistent theme of nuclear in previous generations, except for Japan and South Korea, for whatever reason, engineering expertise or whatever, has been that every project goes over budget and over time. And so now when you layer in the kind of lack of traditional historical expertise, you layer in some element of chaos, it's hard to know what we're going to be able to do on the ground. One angle with nuclear, though, is that you will see now that companies in the tech sector, which obviously have a large amount of free cash flows and have therefore the capital to do it, the likes of Amazon, Google, Microsoft, because of their immense electricity needs for newer generation technologies like data centers and AI, are switching on older, decommissioned nuclear reactors. So that's a very interesting dynamic now where the tech sector, which through its data centers in the US might account for something like 1/5 of all electricity needs in the US just for AI by 2030, they now are looking at nuclear as an opportunity to provide the electricity for that. So in countries like ours, ideally, we don't want to be left behind on like the really good parts of AI, like the tool AI that could have really big impacts. And also we might want to build data centers that could be outsourcing hubs for the rest of the world, which have been great employers in previous generations in the software space, right? So again, we don't want to be left behind. So from a justice standpoint, we think it's worth examining nuclear. We just haven't figured out if it's actually possible to build in a systematic way yet.
Yeah. Thank you for answering that. And on that note, we have a question that's AI related, and this might be our last question for today's talk. How much have the energy use patterns from AI data centers changed the picture of likely trajectories over the last couple of years?
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I'll just dive a little bit further into that. There is no substitute for markets in a sustained way of taking technologies and helping to scale them up and deploy them at scale, right? I think there's institutions like the World Bank, national governments, multilateral frameworks, minilateral alignments that can help to get technologies and are absolutely necessary for technologies to get to a certain point. But there is no substitute for the market then taking over and scaling the thing, right? So this could be dispositively impactful, right? The growth of AI and the energy guzzling needs of AI and its data centers will probably be extremely important to switching back on and moving forward a lot of nuclear and other technologies as well. You need these really like high velocity, high free cash flow generating industries to scale up the thing. And it's this kind of, the irony sort of flows in both directions because those industries are going to significantly impact energy needs and probably contribute a lot to emissions globally. And so it's a good thing that they're switching on these really low carbon technologies.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we covered a number of things here today in terms of the question. I'm really excited personally to see what the Institute for Climate Innovation will be working on and to see the website being launched soon. And so with that, I'd like to conclude this session. If you have additional questions, don't forget, you can find Varun's office hours in the agenda following this talk. A link to the meeting for office hours should be in the live interaction tab. Somebody that is volunteering should be able to pass that in the live interaction tab. So feel free to join. There are some questions that we didn't get to answer, but yes, feel free to join the office hours to ask Varun directly if you wanted to chat. On that note, thank you so much, Varun, for the great presentation and for answering the questions today. And thank you, the audience, for watching. Enjoy the rest of your conference weekend.
Thank you. And sorry again for the noise at the beginning, but thank you everyone for attending. Take care.